Welcome to week 7. This is the Profcast for week 7. We're doing storytelling, composition, and photography. Last week, we were doing the elements of design, if you recall. We looked at these 7 elements of design. We looked at it in a number of different ways. We had a whole session on album photography. We looked at album art, with Nicholas, my son. We did a whole session looking at some paintings, photographs, and advertising design, which we're going to hint back at a couple things today. We did a in-class session on photography where you were to create a photograph based on some props, a photograph of your hands. And then we also did between sessions class on Canva, a tutorial to help you get going for those of you who are doing especially the infographic project. Okay, now we're going to come back. We've got all of these projects that are coming up, right? The infographic is due next week. It must be an original infographic. You have to have had your idea approved by me. You have to have had provided me a design sample that was not the same as your topic. There are 4 elements for each of those projects. And for the infographic, you have to use Canva. For the photography project, you can use any software you want, but we suggest Adobe Express. Because it's actually a great storyline software. And same thing for the podcast. You can use any software you want, but I do like Podbean because I think it's just very simple and helpful. So these are, when we think about these 7 elements of design, they actually move towards telling a story. And that's what we're looking at this week: storytelling, composition, and composing, making things happen, and photography and how that works. So we think of this iconic Beatles photo here. What's the story? Well, that's actually a bit hard to know exactly. I mean, there is a sense of movement. There's a sense of diversity and unity here. And I think those 2 things capture the Beatles pretty well. This also locates them on a fairly normal street in their world, Abbey Road. And so it connects them to this kind of blue-collar reality of these kind of fairly high-level artists who are globally popular. And I think the storytelling is in that picture, but you kind of have to know something about the Beatles to make that thing happen. Same thing when we come to this famous painting by Koksai that we looked at for these elements of design last week. There may be something else going on, but there certainly is a story going on as we see the fishermen and the waves. Now, what is story? And so I asked somebody in class about storytelling. I said, what sound does a clock make? And that student, one of you, answered tick tock. I think certainly in my culture, that's how we answer that question. Tick tock. A clock makes a sound, tick tock. However, a clock doesn't make the sound tick tock. Have you ever noticed that the clock actually makes a sound tick, 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 tick? So why do we think it makes a sound tick tock? It's because human beings, us, most of us anyway, those of us who aren't secretly androids hiding amongst us, human beings are storytelling people. We need to have a story, a sense of things within a story framework. We're always telling stories, looking for ourselves in stories, sharing stories, and we are in the midst of a story and we don't know how it ends. And for many of us, we don't have a clear sense of even where we are in that story. And so what we do is we take the most mundane, the most normal everyday thing, a clock, and we make it go, instead of tick, 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 endlessly, we make it tick, tock. Okay, and what's the nature of a story? Beginning, middle, end. Tick, tock. The beginning, the space between, that whole infinity of moments that can happen within a second, and then tock the next second. So beginning, middle, and end. At the very basic, that's what a story is. A beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's true, the infographic design doesn't tell a huge story. We should be able to tell the story from quickly looking at your infographic and the title, right? The infographic of infographics was how infographics are about data visualization. That's the story. Your infographic on mental health resources, how to access them, that's the story. You can access mental health resources in this way. If your infographic, is on Stanley Cup statistics, you can say, here's the story of the Stanley Cup history for hockey in Canada and the United States. So the story is fairly simple. In the photography project, the story is really the whole thing. Like, it's the most important thing, as it is with the podcast and the pitch project. I mean, the pitch project and the photograph really is all about the story. The podcast, you're framing a story, and it can also be about research and some other things too. Now, so what we're going to do is look just briefly at other ways of thinking about story, and then we're going to apply some of these questions to those same design images that we had from last week. Okay, so this is Northrop Frye. He's a Canadian public intellectual. He was a United Church minister, a pastor, someone who leads a congregation, teaches theology and religious studies, and he also was a literary critic, and really probably one of Canada's most famous, I would say Canada's most famous literary critic ever. Okay, so he had an understanding of story, and he would draw pictures of how stories worked. And he came up with this circle, and so notice we have springtime, winter, autumn, and summer. So notice the story circle, sorry, it goes spring, summer, autumn, winter. The circle goes this way. That's our year, notice? And he kind of felt stories had a pretty good way of falling into the year, falling into the calendar. Okay. However, when he talked about things, the stories didn't just follow. They didn't always start in springtime and end in springtime, although some did that sort of thing. What he talked about were different kinds of movements. And so let me just create a pointer here. I'm going to go ahead and change the color to something that's a little less dramatic. Okay, so he created some colors. So for example, when we're talking about tragedy, the story of tragedy, there is this place where the tragedy starts up here. The person's like a king or a queen. That's a king or a queen's crown. Do you see that? See how that's awesome design. Isn't that awesome design? And what happens is that great person, the famous actor or the great royalty or whatever, they have a fall and it ends in tragedy. So what is a springtime or summer feel? Everything is wonderful and going well, goes and collapses into tragedy. So Romeo and Juliet actually doesn't begin super well, but lovers in love, they fall in love, they meet, but it turns out their love is star-crossed. They're not meant to be together, and so they end in suicide and death. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, that's a tragedy. Okay? Now, we're not great at telling tragedies anymore. It's not part of our art of visual storytelling on television or film, or in novels. However, if you look at hip-hop, there's lots of tragedy in hip-hop. I mean, look at Kendrick Lamar's work and you can see tragedy taking place. Kendrick Lamar's stories and characters don't always end well, right? He's often talking in different voices and he's bringing out different kinds of storytelling. I admire him greatly as a storyteller. Okay, so that we have here, we have the tragedy. And so the tragedy starts up high, but it ends low. That's tragedy. Okay, what color do we want to make? Let's do another one, shall we? Okay, let's do comedy. Bump it up. So comedy, and you're thinking, oh, I know what comedy is. Comedy is funny, right? Okay, well, that's interesting. But a comedy in a traditional sense is a story that begins in a pretty good space and then kind of moves through and ends in another space. So it actually goes through the whole cycle and then ends up again back here where things are well. So the standard rom-com begins this way. A person, has all those hopes and dreams and these sorts of things, but then something happens, there's a failure, but then they meet somebody, but then there's tension with that somebody, and then they fall in love, and then it ends back up here in the story that ends back up in romance. It's really quite lovely. So comedy has this first cycle. It begins, there's this descent, and then there is the ending of things. That's a pretty good ending. Now there are other stories, irony and satire, okay, which are basically turning things upside down, and they're kind of funny because they actually they might take a tragedy or a comedy and they actually kind of do it this way, right? So they kind of flip everything, so it's hard to know what's going on. What I really want to talk about too, for just like a third one here, is to actually look at, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Let's pick another color. Boom, boom, boom. Let's go ahead and look at the fairy tale, okay? So with a fairy tale, and you know what fairy tales are, right? So, but a fairy tale Notice that there's not always fairies in fairy tales. It's kind of a funny thing that way, right? A fairy tale is an adventure story. It's what they used to call romance. It's this world of adventure. And so we think of The Hobbit. The Hobbit is a fairy tale. It begins with Frodo, and he's very happy, and he's in his house, but then he's sent off in an adventure, and there's all kinds of perils. He goes through all kinds of struggles, and then he faces those struggles, he defeats them, and he ends up back in his home. It's a there and back again story. Notice it also follows the same as the comedy. It follows the same sort of form. Okay? That's the nature of a fairy tale. It's a there and back again story. You go out on an adventure and you come back again. It's kind of an interesting form. And intriguingly, Northrop Frye, as I said, he was a religion scholar, a church minister. For him, the greatest story that follows that pattern is the story of the cross. Oops, that's not a very good cross. But anyway, the story of Jesus dying and rising again for the sake of the world. It's that full story. It's a comedy. It's a good news story. And the word gospel means good news, good story. Okay, so that's the way that he brought those things together. And so comedies and fairy tales tell this story. Now, there are also sort of artists of today that do this. I think the show Comedy by Dan Harmon, I think it's a brilliantly written TV show. And apparently there's a movie in the works, but there's always a rumor that there's a movie in the works for this show. A very unusual show in its history. However, it had largely the same sort of pattern. And I'll just pick another color here just so we can distinguish it. When it comes to comedy, what would happen is they began at the table, right? They began here at this table at the beginning of the show, and then something would happen. They go out into the world, they go to class or they go to the thing. Some adventure ensues. There's dissolution. Everything's in disarray. Their whole friendship's in trouble. The school's going to fail. The whole world is going to fall apart. But then they figure out how to bring it back at the end. Now, that might be a pillow fort war, blanket fort war. It might be the paintball gun war. It might be a detective series. It might be a falling in love question. It might be a question of friendship tested and renewed. But Dan Harmon always follows the same thing. And they actually literally end up back at the table at the end of the episode. So they actually end up back in the same spot for most of those episodes. It's a really intriguing pattern following Northrop Frye's circle of story. Okay, so we have this story here, which is kind of a neat story. In the end, it still comes down to beginning, middle, and end. So that whole cycle ends up being that sort of thing. End, tick, tock, beginning, middle, and end. And what I'm looking at this week is that when you come to your stories, that they still have maybe some more complexity. Is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it an adventure story? Is it something else? Is it a question? Open question? So you're going to be making a story that does something. At its basic, it's tick-tock, beginning, middle, and end, but there's more to the story. Okay, now in photography, how do you tell a story with one picture? This picture, is it really easy to tell what that story is? Well, no, not the whole story, but I can see in that picture, notice how time and age are both part of this picture. We have clocks from different periods. We also have clocks and a wall in a different eras of decay. Notice that? Time is passing, and we see that the clocks themselves don't just show time, but they also show it passing. So there's a story there. The story, this famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, the whole story is here, right? So we have Christ, we have, the bread and the wine that are part of the Eucharist, the Mass, the Last Supper that they shared together. Bread and wine that becomes part of the daily and weekly rhythm of Christians that follow for the next 2,000 years and more. Okay, we have Christ here, whose hands are like this, right? They're beginning to show what it means to hang on the cross. So we have that story that's there. But we also have all the characters, John the Beloved. We have people testing John, trying to find out what's going on. We have Judas and Peter betraying Jesus. The story is all there, told in this painting. But we also have that sense that I said that there was this pointing out to the world, that there was this sense that the Christ story moves out, away from the table and out into the world. Okay, so there's story there. It's hard to tell exactly what the story is, but I do have the sense of a French village. I do have a sense of perspective changing, how even those French villages caught in time, notice how time is just sweeping across it, right? As this bush in front blows up like flame. Maybe this is the burning bush that Moses hears the word of God from, and thus begins the faith of the Jews, the religion of the Jews. I don't know. These Inuksuks from the Inuit culture, this one in Nova Scotia, in Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia, this painting, this picture, this gorgeous, a brilliant picture, and the thing inside it are each telling stories. The Inukshuk tells this asymmetrical kind of story where things are not exactly the same on the other side, and yet there's still this kind of story of humanity and memory that's part of this. Okay? That people leave these memory boxes, these memory works of art as they go through their nomadic travels through the north. But the painting itself is also telling a story. The picture itself is also telling a story. And I think that that's a sunset, not a sunrise. And that's an important distinction. The sense of there's a threat of the Inuit expression disappearing. This great poster of The Dark Knight, Batman The Dark Knight, tells that story. It's... Notice it's not just night and day, but night and what, colored disillusion, right? We have the Joker and the Batman, two sides. They're psychologically linked in this great battle that's going to take place in this film. Here we have the story of the Pieta. This is Mary holding Christ as he dies, right? We have this story that's in there, this falling that's taking place, this compassion that's there. The Mother of God holding the Son of God is the painting. Here, this Jewish picture of a Christian Jesus, a Jewish Christian Jesus, tells the story of Jesus dying on the cross as a Jewish person that's a Jewish prayer cloth that's covering his private parts. And we have the story of the cross. Look at the light of God coming down upon that. And yet there's this whole story of the Holocaust, of the Jewish punishment for just being Jewish by actually a series of people. Here it's Russia, and then this is actually before the Holocaust, so this is Russia. Then this story gets taken up because in Germany the people have to escape. People are fleeing. Russia has persecuted the Jews, and now that's moving into Germany, and it's just going to be terrible. World War II and the Holocaust is about to follow. All of that story is going on here in this painting. Even this simple design, we can see the painting. Someone has spilled, right? But there's a wipe that is going to pick it up. It breaks the story. It's kind of cool. This great story, how, in a sense, you're bringing the whole world closer. You're going from continent to continent, just like handing a package from one floor to another, as these two women do. These two women might be the same person. Do you see? That might be an interesting part, or twins. Notice the coming together of the world. Then there's also a sense of, like, is that an alien? Like, what's going on in the picture of the world? I don't know. This piece here of homelessness, this is the inside of someone's home. This is a box. The story's there. Now, it uses word elements to do that, and a photography project does. Now, what's the story here? This really cool juxtaposition piece? I think it'd be interesting to ask that question about these children playing through that perspective. This story is really clear. Words kill wars. Right? Think of the Muslim idea of the jihad of the pen, the idea that you can conquer instead of with the sword or political persuasion or money. You can conquer with ideas, with art, and that's there as well, using photography to combine the bullet and the pencil. Pretty great. This is a pretty great idea of writing. Same thing. This one, ketchup's made out of tomatoes. Just brings us back to the land. That's the whole story there. In this story, parking is hard and it's delicate, and Volkswagen can help you park. What's this story? Well, I think it's hope, but there's also all that stuff of contrast. Other things. What's this story? It's kind of open for you. Now, when we come to, I love this photograph, and I just really wanted to show it again. But what's the story? I just want to know the story. Don't you want to know? Well, in a photo essay, you can start to tell that story. All right, we looked at the artwork of Paul Lewin. last week, and you gave interpretations about design, and I really liked your interpretations generally. Make sure you give very specific examples in your interpretation, and your marks will be higher on those sorts of things. Some of his work, I don't know what the story is here. There is movement in this piece, but notice this looks like a fashion shot. It's a still shot. It's like of a great queen or something, right? There's a stillness, even though there's movement in this piece. And in this piece, notice it's iconographic. It's like a picture of a god or a goddess, right? Okay. There's still movements in the piece. Look, notice the smoke and the water coming out of the bowl. Now, in this one, I don't get really a sense of the story, but in this one, I do feel like this is a creation story that comes out of Africa instead of out of other parts of the world, even though human civilization begins in Africa. The crow being very symbolic in many ways, the butterfly that's caught in the bubble or pictured in the future. We have the cosmic imagery here. We have water of life that's pouring out of the bowl of this particular creation figure. The meditative pose. I really, really think, I really feel creation in this particular piece. Okay, and if you think of Genesis, the book, the Jewish story and Christian story at the Genesis, the book that begins the Bible, it begins, and in the beginning, the waters, right? There's chaos and disillusion in the waters, but the Spirit of God hovers over the surface of the deep, it says in Genesis chapter 1. And you can see the smoke is almost like that Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the waters. But then the smoke that rising up is much like how indigenous people use smoke from campfires and other kinds of smoke to image the idea of prayers going up to the Creator. Do you see all of that coming here? So there's definitely a story here. And this one even further would be really fun to know more of the story and come back to the story. But we can see there's multiple stories that are going on here. The village, the community in behind, this figure here, and this figure of next generation or fairy figure to the left. And then this little one, the baby, who's actually looking back at us in the picture. I think it's great. Now, sometimes pictures we just need to know more about. When we look at this picture, we have some limitations on what the story is, partly because even though this is online, this picture has been published online, this is really a fuller picture, and we can see it in different ways. And when we do, there's actually more cosmic and creational elements, those mushrooms and things like that. There's just more to this painting there than before. And sometimes we reshape pictures. This picture here is a pretty cool science fiction picture of this woman, this space center, planetary center in the background. But then we have these design elements and then this embryonic figure, the figure of something being born in the mind that's going on here. Well, I take one kind of picture and then I add N.K. Jemison's quotation to it and I create a new story. Do you see how I do that? How gratifying to accept myself and begin spinning the futures I see. Notice the futures in her imagination. Okay. Same thing with this story. We can see that Kokusai is capturing the story of these fishermen who are caught in the waves. How big are these waves? Well, maybe they're a tsunami or not. The sky does not look like a tsunami sky, but that can happen later. When we have back there Fuji-san, what we have is this great mountain, the biggest mountain in Japan, the most mountainous mountain in Japan, and it's smaller than the waves. Do you see how that tells the story of the danger of the fishermen? What are they leaning against their oars, trying to stay alive, right? That does tell the story. However, this painting becomes even more interesting when we give it cultural context. This painting was painted at the moment, and became popular at the moment when for the first time foreigners are coming into Japan to trade. Americans and Asians and some Europeans are coming in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, coming into Japan. And so we actually see Japan from outside of Japan. This is an image of Japan from the east, so looking westward to Japan. And so it's an unusual painting. Usually paintings are in Japan, of Japan, not outside of Japan, looking at Japan. So knowing the context gives us more story. Likewise, I told you this cool painting by Basquiat and how the Strokes have used it as their album cover. So I get the album cover for the Strokes, the New Abnormal, great album. Then I find there's this cool poster inside. Then I find out about what the poster is. I find out about, in this case, it's Jean-Michel Basquiat's. It's a 40-year-old poster. I'm very excited about it, painting. I'm excited about it. And then I find out that it's Basquiat's painting, Bird on Money, meant to capture a jazz artist's life. And now there's more story and more story. Do you see that? So paintings can add more story. In any case, what we're looking for is the story element. What is the story? Sometimes you do that with just the painting, the picture, the photograph, but it would be really hard to know the whole story here without the title and the background. Okay? And so sometimes you need more elements and sometimes you need less, but the storytelling remains. So this week's activities, what's going on? So first, what you're going to do is you're going to read this very short, it'll only take you a few minutes to read and look at, the very short photo essay, Interpretations of Wartime Photography. It's got pictures by Dimitar Dilkov. Okay, some of the pictures I don't think are the best, but as a whole, it's a important little piece. It'll only take a few minutes to read, and then there's a series of questions that are at the end of that on page 10 and 11. I want you to respond with the thesis statement, the argument that resonates most, and send me a 1-paragraph response by 5 p.m. Tuesday. This is the time that we have for quizzes. Send me that by Tuesday. The second activity is I want you to look at another photo essay. Okay. Again, this won't take a long time to read, but it's quite a number of pages. So you're going to have to dedicate some time to this reading. 6 must-have shots for photo essays. If you're doing the photography project, and more than half the class is doing the photography project, you will want to know this. Not only do you get 6 great ideas, but they give you 2 samples of photography essays that have those 6 shots, those 6 ideas, and a whole series, like 5 pages of worksheets to work this through. This is a template, a model for what you can do for your photograph project. And what I want you to do this week is just take your cameras on your cell phones, nothing particularly fancy, nothing kind of worrisome, just take your normal cell phones, and I want you to take those shots, okay? So it can be 6 shots, just the 6 shots, or it can be more. These photo sheets here have 9 and 10 10 pictures. And I want you to tell a story that has, with those pictures, that has all 6 of the shots, the hero shot, the character, the person in the photograph, etc. Okay? These 6 must-have shots are great. Now you can really do this in any way you want. I'm not judging the photography quality provided you capture the hero shots. I mean, these photographs are just gorgeous, right? Hero shot, all the different kinds of elements that are there. The 6 elements are hidden in these examples. I want you to give me a 1-page sheet. Okay. Use just a Word document if you like, or Google Doc. I want you to send me in PDF or a Word doc a 1-page sheet that has your 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 photographs, however you want, all on the same sheet, designed like this, nice kind of symmetrical design, so it makes sense, or like this. Okay. I want you can include a title, so your thing can be, a leaf on a tree or something, whatever your story is, and send it to me by Wednesday, an hour before class. Now, this can be any story. You're going to tell the story, so you can add some element to it. So, for example, if you wanted to tell the story of you could tell the story of a coffee mug that's out in the wilderness. That's fine. Okay. You can tell the story of one of our creatures that we have on campus, the crows or the fox, or the foxes, or little moles or mice. You can go down the trail just a little bit and you can take pictures of birds. You can tell the stories of trees living and dying. Anything you want. It can be connected to what your final photography project will be, or it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be. It's totally up to you. Okay. So tell that story. Send it to me 1 hour before class. We're looking in these in class. And then we're having in class, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking a bit more about composition, another exercise, so make sure you have your phones with you. Also, between the two classes on Wednesday, for those that are doing the photography project, this is totally optional, but a fun way to extend your learning. We're going to go on a photo sunset walk, a sunset photography walk. So right after the 4 p.m. class at 5:30, we're meeting at SDU Main in the front doors. Have your cameras with you. So make sure you take a camera like this. I'm also going to have a camera that's a little bit nicer, a DSLR camera, like a traditional camera. And we're just going to walk down the path as the sun is setting, take some pictures, and just talk about how light is working and how the pictures are working and see what we can capture. It's not a long walk, but bring good shoes and a light jacket because it'll be cool at that time of day. The temperature is dropping really quickly. Bring a supper or a lunch. Bring a friend. It doesn't matter. We could have 5 people could go, or we could have 50 people. It doesn't matter. Just don't get in each other's pictures, okay? So we're just going on a walk, and we'll come back, and I'll be ready. So this is before the 7 p.m. class or before the after the 4 p.m. class, okay? So in either case, if you're in the 7 p.m. session, you need to have your reading and activity number 2 done probably, before you go on this walk, or you won't be able to complete it, okay? So this is free, totally optional. I'm going on the walk, and I hope you go with me. Okay. After class this week, on Wednesday night or Thursday, I want you to find a great story picture, some famous photo or painting, and just tweet briefly about it to hashtag ACLC1080. And remember our planning days on Fridays. Last week was the planning session. I just sent it out as a announcement on Moodle. I may return to a video this week or just continue to do that. In any case, whatever. Remember your weekly rhythm. Remember all the things that you have to do. Okay. In this case, you've got something like you've got one activity that's due tomorrow by 5, Tuesday by 5 p.m. You've got another activity that's due 3 or 6 p.m. on Wednesday, an hour before class begins, and then reflection and response after. Okay, remember all of this. Remember to reach out to me if you have questions or concerns, anything that you need. I would love to meet with you and help you. We are at the point, though, you need to know that you need to have your work done. It's time. No more late activities. I haven't been accepting them unless you've talked to me anyway, late. But those design elements projects, I'm not accepting those late. They are due when they're due. So the infographic, a week from Wednesday on November 9th at midnight, and then the photography project a week later, the podcast project a week after that, and the pitch project after that. Okay. Really want to hear from you, and I can't wait to see you all in class. Take care.